the
Sorry,
Thank you, David.
I had
Sorry.
to record this. We've had so many requests because people at Christmas parties and
If
things like that.
if
Yeah.
you're not comfortable being recorded as well, please take yourself off camera. That's absolutely fine. I'm not going to be offended. I wish I could take myself off camera today, but it doesn't matter. So, as I mentioned in Welsh there, in y Gymraeg, this is the fifth annual Tenant Pulse Report. So this gathers insights from tenants across Wales. I am the author. I was supported by Akshita and David and Iona, who've been great. And it is partly funded by Welsh Government because we as TPAS Cymru are partly funded by Welsh Government. But I just wanted to say a big diolch and vow to our Tenant Voice sponsor, which is Pobl. They sponsor this specific report and hearing the tenant voice, and without them, this kind of research would not be able to happen. So I think that's very, very important to note. Right, David, I'm going to pass it over to
I
you
mean,
now to just give a bit
some
of
of you are
background.
veterans of this. You know what Tenant Pulse is, but it was set up now. It's probably close to about 8 years ago now, um, as a tenant voice platform for you to have your say on issues. Generally, we do ones on themes like rent or service charges, things like that. But this time is the general one. We try and have one a year, which is consistent, asking similar questions about just state of the nation, how you feel. So Tenant Pulse is a database, it's growing, and it gives you a chance to share your experiences. And it is read and absorbed and used by Welsh Government. You'll see it being quoted in the Senedd. I'm meeting with the most senior housing civil servant this afternoon at 3 o'clock. Your voice does matter in this. It really does. And I say, it's part of Welsh Government. Look forward to seeing these results. Yeah. I don't know if it moves on. I can't move it on, sorry.
And then a little bit about TPAG.
Yeah,
No, it's fine, I've just moved it on.
so some of you might be familiar with TPAG. We're going to have some new conversations, I think, in the new year, Olivia. It was originally set up as a Tenant Pulse advisory group. So they see the results, they see the questions in advance to help us shape them, any issues with them and things like that. But I've sensed from TPAG that they want to be involved in more wider stuff. I recently had some useful information from them about body cams and stuff like that. So I think there needs to be a new conversation in the spring about the role of GPAG and how we can maybe widen it and include. There's a feeling that members want to be involved in more things rather than just Pulse. So
Yeah.
hopefully you'll see an invite for that in the spring.
Yeah, and I also wanted to issue a big thank you to the members of TPAC as well. I can see some of us on this call, so that's great. Thank you to them for giving their feedback and testing things and kind of suggesting amends to questions. It definitely does go a long way, and that's
Yeah.
the behind the scenes stuff that people don't always recognize. So I think that's really important to say. Um, okay, and next bit for you, Dave.
So I'll be we want to get to the detail, but this is part of a number of things we do at GPAS as part of Tenant Voice. So Pulse is there, the Tenant Voice Cymru forums, the tenant networks. The online listening, we do a lot of scanning of Reddit, Facebook, Discord, all sorts of places in order to listen to the tenant voice. Really important work, and this is one part of it. Yeah.
Okay, right. Just wanted to briefly touch upon some things that are different or new this year. And one of them is you'll notice it's got a slightly different look. To the reports, there's a little bit more boxes, there's some different images and different layout. There's also chapters essentially or matters that they've been split into, which is something I did because our slogan motto is You Matter Team Covery, and it tied in quite nicely with a sort of double meaning of matters, findings that you find and things that genuinely matter to tenants as well. I also included a context and methodology section just to kind of enrich the overall report, make sure there was a little bit of a background and have a sort of more structured feel to it. We did have more language options this year as well. So we included the top five most spoken languages in Wales, which are English, Welsh, Polish, Punjabi, Romanian, and Urdu. We didn't have a massive take up of people using these languages, but that's definitely something for us to look at in the next one and make sure that there are more people who are using these languages that are filling in this report, because it's really important to get those voices included. There's also a focus group opt-in, which I will mention in a few slides, but that's different this year. And we also had a prize change. So, sorry, David, because David had a
I was
previous
outvoted on this.
the previous prize was like a Welsh food gift bag. It was lovely. But I decided to change it to be a £25 multi-store voucher because it was, for me, I felt more in line with sort of cost of living issues and things like that. It's coming up to Christmas, and I think it was sort of more versatile. And there are also references to wider research where potentially there may be gaps in this report, rather than just assuming that certain things are fact. If they're not as representative, I've tied it into perhaps broader research around that topic just to kind of ground it. Um, so the prize draw winner of the £25 multi-store voucher is Anne Pates from Pontypridd. It's not like someone's won the lottery or anything, so I'm not giving anything too dangerous away there, but congratulations to Anne for that. And as I mentioned about the changes, so this is something we did this year with CHC. So CHC are the sort of umbrella organisation for registered social landlords in Wales. We've actually got Josh from CHC on the call, and they did add some sort of questions that they worked with with us in tandem, and those were questions 9 and 14, which I will mention. And it was really to make sure that, not obviously taking anything away from tenants, but that this report enriches the overall sector. And I just wanted to thank CHC as well for those additions to the report, and I will go over them when I discuss them. So, as I mentioned, there was also the opt-in to be contacted to be part of a focus group. Now, you'll see when I go over the demographics, there are certainly demographics which do need to be represented more, and it's not good enough to just say, oh, there weren't enough, there weren't enough. So what we wanted to do this year is to offer people who belong to one or more of these underrepresented groups, which we get information from, to have the option to be contacted to be part of a focus group. Now, obviously, not everyone who's opted in for this can be part of the focus group. They're quite small, but those will be taking place in the new year. And it's really to gain that qualitative understanding of how housing impacts these certain groups. So I just wanted to include that as well in these slides. Right, the campaign. You might have seen this. You might have seen me over your socials as well, talking about this launch. So we had the slogan, quite catchy, like "Home Sweet Home, how's yours?" Because that's quite a notable thing that a lot of people recognise. And we had this sent out, like the overall survey, to our Pulse database, and then the landlords from across Wales. It was also posted by myself, not because I'm very sad, but because I wanted to make sure we were reaching all types of tenants, particularly where perhaps in certain areas there weren't as high of a response rate. So I personally got our way in as Cheap As Cymru into some community groups, which you'll see on the screen. You might even be a part of these community groups yourselves and you might have seen it, but yes. David is just going to talk to you a little bit about
Well,
the
not a lot to
advert.
say, really. As you know, we want to reach not just the usual suspects or people on mailing lists, but people, just tenants going around their life, especially private renters, as this
Yeah,
pulse includes private renters. So we used Facebook, Meta is the platform, Meta's platform to run adverts on Facebook and Instagram, targeting certain demographics, and also to target younger people, to get that broader sense and broader depth, especially for private rental sector. It's really important. You don't,
yeah.
private rental sector is not a community you're a member of. You just go around your life. So we need to push adverts to them to reach private renters. Yeah.
Definitely, yeah, outside of our usual networks.
Hmm.
Um, so for the demographics, we had a total of 770 respondents, and these were all ages from 18 plus. The majority were 66 years of age plus, and they were predominantly social housing, which you'll see when I go into the breakdown after. We had all four regions of Wales, so north, south west, south east, mid and west. And as David kind of touched upon there, We had a mixture of renters, so those in private rentals, social rentals, and supported housing as well. Kind of capture that. So, response in tenure type, as you can see, and again, this kind of ties into who our networks are, which is why those adverts and things like that and Facebook groups are important. They are mainly in the social sort of housing sector. So you can see we've got housing associations, private rentals, local authority, supported housing, other. For the purposes of this report, we grouped housing association renters, local authority renters, and supported housing renters together as social housing. And then those in private were just a separate group. Then we've got here some further insights in terms of the underrepresented groups. So we asked the respondents, do you or anyone in your household consider yourself to belong to any of the following underrepresented groups? And they could click all that apply. So it's important to note with these figures that intersectionality exists. Just because you belong to one group or someone in your household does, you can also kind of flow into others. But we did see that respondents who had a disability, someone in the household with a disability or sensory loss were the largest group. Um, and then we also had neurodiverse households that appeared more frequently, interestingly, in the private sector. So there's a bit of a split sometimes, and you'll see in the report, which David will link in the comments later on, certain groups are more likely to belong to certain tenure types. So we saw that there were more older people in social housing, and then certain other groups more predominantly in the private rental sector. Um, and we've got the bottom, Black, Asian, and ethnic minority representation remains low. It was at 1% from last year, but I will definitely take it on board that that figure is nowhere near enough representative of the general population of 6% in Wales. And that is something we're looking at in terms of the focus groups and expanding our networks further. Um, right, renting situations. So this was new this year as well. So we asked renters who did they live, what was their renting situation essentially. And you can see here, majority said that they live alone. That can tie in with the fact that a lot of the respondents were older, and that can have implications in terms of lone living. But then we had some, live with a partner, live with a partner, child, and children. And we just kind of wanted that to help build the overall picture that we tried to discover. Um, okay, sources of income also really important. So the majority of the respondents on this survey said that their main source of household income was universal credit. This was actually an increase from the last year. So this has increased 2% from 2024 survey. And those with the highest levels of welfare, the main sources of income were carers, disabled and or sensory loss households, in addition to neurodiverse households. And then in the private sector, it was much more likely that work was their main source of income. So that was 68% in comparison to social households. Okay, I wanted to state as well, something really important when you're talking about any bit of research, it does have limitations, and I think it's important to be honest and acknowledge those. So this survey was conducted online. So with that, you do miss people who don't have that digital access. Also, hang on, I can't see my slide. Results mainly reflect social housing tenants due to sample size, but there is a decent amount of private, but we want to see that increasing again next year. As I mentioned there, some ethnic groups are underrepresented. And I think it's important to note that Gypsy, Roma, and Irish traveller communities are not fully captured in surveys like this because how they live is incredibly different to how settled people live in terms of tenure type and the like. Some housing types can often be hard to compare, for example, supported housing. Not all the questions as well can be compared to our previous surveys, but we do have some key trends that we can compare year on year, which I will go into. Okay. So, finding matters, the important stuff, the stuff, not that that stuff isn't important, it's vital as well to build that framework, but this is what we kind of took and found from that kind of background mapping and demographics. So, when we looked at housing security and affordability matters, long-term renting remained the most popular choice. So we asked renters, how would you describe your current renting situation? And 61% of renters in this survey said that long-term renting is the most popular one. However, when we dug a little deeper, only 39% of private renters selected this option in comparison to 67% of social housing respondents. Now, we know that social homes are becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. We also know, based on this survey, that quite a lot of the respondents were from social housing and were older, so it might be that that's seen as a more permanent fixture for them. We know as well that housing insecurity remains because 17%, which was the second most popular answer, chose the option I'm not settled in my home. And we wanted to find out why. So when we asked people why, why is that, they were allowed to kind of have a drop-down option to go into it. And the data revealed that the main issues were damp and disrepair, including health and safety issues because of this, affordability issues, a lot of people saying as well that home was unsuitable for their needs, specifically around disability. And after that was antisocial behaviour that kept coming up consistently. And tenure insecurity. So within this group that selected that they weren't settled, there were a lot of private renters basically saying that they didn't feel secure in their home because they weren't sure when their landlord was going to potentially remove them, when they were going to put the property up for sale, if they wanted it back. So it really kind of alluded to those deeper issues when you scratched underneath the surface. And to be honest, some of those comments were quite alarming as well to read and see. But that won't surprise some of you on this call either. And this insecurity, we talk about housing insecurity as if it's not directly linked to tenant well-being, and it is. So housing stress is a direct impact of housing insecurity, and a lot of the respondents did reflect on feelings of being extremely distressed. So, for example, one tenant put, living here affects my mental health, causing suicidal thoughts, yet there is nowhere appropriate to transfer to. Then we've got aspirations of home ownership versus the reality of affordability. So we ask this question every year. We put as an option staying here until I can afford to buy. And only 8% of the whole survey selected this option. This option was more likely to be chosen by younger renters and particularly those in the private sector. However, it's still a low figure. And when we dug a little deeper again, we had the option for them to give commentary on this. They essentially reported that the things that were restricting their ability to buy was high rent in their current property, house prices being too expensive in the area, and high living costs. For younger people and those with children, so a lot of single parents that we surveyed, and those who lived in homes with a partner and children, also reflected things like, I'd like to own a house, something to pass on to the kids, but having enough money for a deposit is almost impossible. It's too expensive to live in the UK. Someone else put, I have a single wage and the high cost of living is making it impossible to get on the ladder, harder to save, especially with children. Um, we then found an overarching theme, which was a lack of control and significant impacts of poverty, which you cannot ignore when it comes to asking people questions around this and renting. So many of the respondents in the qualitative data section actually reflected on the fact that they have no choice but to rent, and that they're almost trapped in this cycle of renting and trapped in this cycle of poverty. So I think that was really important to reflect on as well. And these findings overall demonstrate that the consequences of poverty, insecure tenure, and lack of control extend far beyond affordability alone. There's so many things going on there and so many things to unpack. Okay, we then asked renters, and this was one of the questions that was developed in tandem with CHC. So George, I can see you're on this call, but yeah, thank you for your help with this. And we had the results after tenants were asked to basically select from a range of statements, rank them from 1 to 6, which is most important to you. And they had these statements here. These were the results. So overall, it's quite clear that the top 3, people want to be safe, they want their home to be secure, they want it to be comfortable. And the repairs and maintenance element, again, really vital for majority of renters there. However, it was interesting when we looked at the differences between social renters and private renters because these changed. So for those who rent privately, they put how much my home costs to rent at number one instead of the generic sample. And also this listing here, this is exactly what social housing renters put. So this really reflected that for private renters, that cost of that rent is much higher than the rest of them. And that was quite significant because it has a very, very different outlook in terms of priorities and in terms of perhaps potential priorities for private landlords as well versus social. Oh, I've gone back. Let me go forward. Sorry, I'm clearly not used to this format. Bear with me a second. Oh, okay. Then we went on to affordability. We know that affordability is a consistent issue for many renters. It comes up in so many of our surveys that we've done, ones on rent and the like. So we ask this question every year. We ask renters, um, essentially, if you're struggling to pay for your rental bills, why, if this is the case? Because being able to afford rent and bills are vital elements of existence. And you can see here 31% of our respondents selected the option my bills and living costs have increased. Obviously, second from that is people stating that it's not an issue, they're able to pay for both. However, when we looked at tenure types, we saw that the social renters were least impacted by rent levels because only 6% of social renters chose the option my rent is too high versus private renters who 16% chose that option. So again, it's that rent being a priority for private renters. We're seeing it again. It's that theme coming up. And we found that those who were either single parents, living with children, or living with partners, only 24% chose the option that they don't have any issues paying for rental bills, which was less than the overall average, indicating some potential underlying issues there. And we also found that renters whose main household income was cited as being generated from work were more likely than others to choose the option of not an issue, able to pay for both. Um, so there were some disparities, but we wanted to look a little bit closer at the my bills and living costs have increased and kind of find out, well, what do people perceive living costs as, and what is causing them those issues? So when we asked it through the comments, we found some themes, and these were the main themes that we found. People repeatedly mentioning food prices, cost of food has gone up. We've all seen it, even the bare essentials at the moment are seen as almost luxury. Service charges, again, we've seen that in other surveys, and they've gone up. Utility bills, council tax, that was mentioned quite a lot, specifically also by private renters. That was a real issue that kept coming up in the comments. Transport prices as well, really impacting people's ability to get to employment and even to just have that kind of social interaction. Bedroom tax was mentioned, and then rent came under that as well. I don't think people are going to be that surprised when they see these answers, but it was interesting to look at the themes that came up, and particularly things around the bedroom tax, because that was kind of mentioned quite a few times during this survey. And I also wanted to mention that in terms of universal credit and welfare payments, so if I go back to this graph here, people who were stating that their universal credit and benefit payments were too low are more likely to be social housing tenants than those in the private sector, and that this was their key issue for not being able to afford bills. Households, including individuals with a disability or sensory loss, single parents with children, and older renters, were likely to attribute struggles of paying bills or rent to these low benefit payments as well, which again kind of helps to unpick and unpack that picture of these underrepresented groups and people who are relying on welfare, kind of struggling just to make ends meet and keep a roof over their heads. Excuse me. Okay, we then asked renters, what is the one thing that you would choose to change about your home? And we ask this every year. There were some variations in terms of the way we worded the options, But again, you can see from here, some of them come very closely together. So lots of people selected the option property layout slash size. Um, and then better repairs and maintenance, again, just reflecting those structural issues. However, parking slash antisocial behaviour. Sorry, David. Yeah.
So I just wanted to mention on this one, we've had flack from landlords before saying this is a really unfair question because it says, what's the one thing you change about your home? And some landlords are like, well, we can't do anything about that. I don't have an issue with that. I agree, you can't. But I think it's really important to understand from tenants what's the one thing they change about their home. So we can learn about it. We can think about future homes. We can look at future planning. They're not always ones we can solve straight away as a housing sector. But I maintain this question is really important to ask. What's the one thing you change? Because everybody knows the one thing they change about their home. People like Stephen, it's very obvious. For others, it's different things. But I think it's a really fair question. And I know some landlords are like, well, what should we do about it? But we need to learn. That's the point of it. Yeah.
Definitely. And there was also a higher emphasis from private renters on better repairs and maintenance, whereas social renters were more likely to choose these parking slash ASB issues, which again was quite interesting in terms of what people's priorities are. It has changed as well. So in the previous survey, repairs and maintenance was the top priority, and then energy efficiency came second, and then the layout and size, parking ASB. So again, quite a significant shift for just a year. Um, Energy efficiency has kind of dropped on the overall priority lists throughout this survey when we've asked certain questions, but ASB kind of related issues have started to climb up in comparison to other years. So what do these implications, what does this potentially involve for landlords? Well, for private landlords, there's definitely a need to manage affordability pressures, maintain properties to a high standard, and respond promptly to repair concerns. For social landlords, there is perhaps an indication that they should focus on long-term tenant well-being, addressing repairs, antisocial behaviour and accessibility, while maintaining regulated rents to afford stability. So, landlord matters. This section is all about how tenants felt about their landlord and the sort of communication they provide, and any other suggestions around satisfaction. So, we found landlord interaction definitely matters to people, and we asked them what is the main interaction that they've had with their landlord or letting agent in the last year, and they could select all that applied. So repair and maintenance dominated interactions, and then we had survey and opinion requests that actually increased 5% since 2024. This was more clearly shown in the social renter section. You know, they're being asked more and more frequently for their opinions. However, it had slightly inclined as well in the private rental sphere. So quite promising. Um, I think that definitely kind of reflects that people are being asked their opinions more as renters and perhaps indicating of that broader theme of tenants' rights increasing. However, there is still limited face-to-face engagement. And that's something we've seen year upon year. Those numbers still remain quite low. Again, we have had coronavirus, so that's that potential knock-on impact from that, but it is an incredibly valuable form of interaction. We also saw that there was an increase of 11% since 2024 of renters asking their landlord for support slash advice. This is perhaps something that could be explored slightly more. I think asking what type of support would be useful, whether it's welfare or more, but it was interesting in when you frame it in the context of the pressures that landlords are facing and also the pressures that renters are facing as well. And then we asked, how satisfied were you as a renter with the level of engagement your landlord provides? So in previous years, we only asked, are you satisfied? And we gave the options no, yes. This year we've included unsure slash indifferent because some people, it's not something that matters particularly to them. They're quite neutral on it. And we saw that for private renters, they were more likely than social renters to select this option of being unsure slash indifferent, perhaps because of the nature of private renting, it's much more individualistic. It's not so much of a responsibility of the landlord to deal with other things. However, we did see that social renters were slightly less satisfied, with 29% reporting dissatisfaction. So 29% of them actually chose no, similar to this graph, in comparison to 27% of private renters. Again, it's that different expectations of social renters versus private potentially implies also other issues that we picked up on the report around, ASB, repairs, maintenance, service charges. But it was interesting to note those disparities. Also, households with neurodiverse members reported significantly lower satisfaction levels, with only 39% of them saying that they were satisfied and 41% of them expressed dissatisfaction. Most of these households were in the private sector, highlighting challenges of engagement in a less structured and more independent setting, perhaps. Similarly, households with disability or sensory loss reported lower satisfaction, with 45% responding yes and 35% responding no, indicating that engagement varies across needs. Everyone is an individual, people require different levels of engagement, and it's really important that we take that into consideration when we look at landlord-tenant engagement. Like I said before, being unsure or indifferent matters, and it was more pronounced amongst private renters, particularly younger people as well. Some of them, they just want to rent their home and that's all they want. They want the repairs and maintenance done. They don't necessarily want that interaction engagement from their landlord, which is not surprising. We also asked our renters, what is the main priority you think your landlord should have? And the results were quite clear. So we had number one, which was keeping rents affordable, that was 21%. And secondly, we had clear plans on repairs and maintenance, 20%. And number three was listening to tenants at 19%. So this is social and private combined. There were no significant disparities to note. But I think that number three, listening to tenants, is really important because it shows that tenants across Wales want to feel heard. They want to feel heard. And I think it's important to note that alongside rent controls, repairs and maintenance really was high up there for a lot of the respondents. Okay, we then asked them, overall, how satisfied are you with your landlord? So quite a generic kind of question to ask. And we had varied responses again. So overall, more than half of the respondents, 55%, report either being satisfied or very satisfied with the landlord when you combine those two. While 23% overall were unsatisfied or very unsatisfied. So again, put those two polarizing points and mash them together. So patterns differed also by tenure. So social renters were more likely to report being satisfied, which is interesting. So that was 35% of them versus 22% of private renters. Whereas private renters, again, were often more neutral. So 32% of private renters were neutral, unsure/indifferent, versus 20% of social renters. Again, suggesting that social renters have clearer expectations of landlord performance, while private renters' experiences are more varied. Also notably, underrepresented groups reported lower levels of satisfaction, actually high levels of dissatisfaction. So 14% of Black, Asian and ethnic minority households said they were very dissatisfied or unsatisfied. And 12% of disabled or sensory impaired tenants said the same, 13% of LGBTQ households, and 14% of carers. So again, it's trying to scratch underneath that surface of why are these certain groups reporting this and what can be done, which again, hopefully the focus groups will help us unpick a little bit more. Okay, renting stigma. This is a section that we have kind of tried to dig out a little bit before in other surveys, but we specifically wanted to get a bit of an enriched picture of it in this survey. So this is my personal favourite part because I think it really paints a picture of the reality for so many people when it comes to renting and public attitudes. So we asked renters if respondents or someone in their household had received any negative comments in relation to being a renter within the last 12 months. And these were the results. So you can see, yes, 65% said they had not received any negative comments. However, when we actually picked it and we looked at those who said yes in the last 12 months or yes, but more than 12 months ago, we actually looked at it combined. So the breakdown isn't on this graph for some reason, but it is on the one in the report and you can see it. So when we combined the yes, but more than 12 months ago and the yes in the last 12 months, 26% had reported that they or someone in the household had received negative comments around renting. And that's quite significant, it's more than one in four of the people who responded to this survey. And again, you've always got that unsure because stigma is quite a difficult concept sometimes to pick up. But for those people who reflected on having negative comments made to them about renting, we asked them why and we asked them what happened, how did it make them feel? So when we asked this, we found that certain groups were more likely to experience stigma around renting. Now, interestingly enough, while stigma in social housing is well documented, there's actually a Stop Social Housing Stigma National Tenant Survey that's done in England that David will link in the chat. Um, and it's recognised, as I mentioned. We actually found in this survey that 25% of private renters said that they had experienced negative comments about renting in the past year, which was 8% higher than 17% of social renters who said that they'd reported the same. And as I mentioned, kind of less visibility is given to this type of stigma with private renting. There are organisations such as Generation Rent and Acorn who try and bring it, Shelter Cymru, to the forefront, but there's a lot of discrimination that can happen underneath the surface in an unregulated setting. And I thought that these findings kind of unpick that. Obviously, there needs to be a little bit more data to kind of help to pad it out, but it was certainly a very interesting insight. And I'll go into what they said. So, when we asked the tenants and the renters on the survey to do reports and talk about what they found with these incidences, some of these words on the screen come up, and I'm not going to lie, some of them are horrific. Like they were talking about, class-based judgments and the like. Some people reported being talked about as scum, scroungers, and there was a lot of emotional pain, I suppose, in a lot of these comments. And when we unpicked these comments, we found these themes. So, number one was classism and being treated as a second-class citizen narrative. So, several renters described being made to feel socially inferior because they rent, often reporting clear divisions between homeowners and renters in their community, and being treated as second-class citizens or not good enough for the housing estate, particularly those in social housing who reported that they felt and had been told they lower the tone or referred to as them up in social housing. Then we have moral judgments about hard work, success, and failure. So, quite a few of the private renters and social renters also reported that people had told them they clearly don't work hard enough to buy. A lot of under 30s said that they get comments made by family and friends sometimes saying, you're wasting your money paying for someone else's mortgage. Shouldn't you have bought a house by now? And there's just a lack of understanding that that is not a choice. Um, and some of them also reflected on sort of feeling like they were scroungers or being called useless, and that renting was dead money. Again, not a clear understanding that it's not a choice. Then stigma and prejudice specific to social housing. As I mentioned, although this report talks about private renters saying they were more likely to feel this, the qualitative data of social housing respondents really revealed that they reported comments that, stigma is explicit and more severe. So they've been called scum. A lot of people put that word came up a lot. Scum, scroungers. I'm sorry also if this is upsetting to hear from anyone and if you've been affected by this yourself. But yeah, these incidents demonstrate that social renters often experience a dual burden. So they have that renting stigma and then the stigma of being a social housing tenant as well, and a lack of understanding of the pride that comes within these communities and just being dismissed. Then there were perceptions that renting again is a financial mistake, that people are idiots because they're paying someone else's mortgage. Um, and again, misunderstandings of the financial constraints that renters face. And there were also personal attacks linked to health, employment, or circumstances. Many respondents reported that, they were disabled and unable to work, and that people essentially were blaming them for their circumstances, which were beyond their control. So again, some really stark accounts were revealed in that. Okay, tenant satisfaction matters. So we wanted to ask in this section, we had statements and they had to rate them in stars, basically. So 5 stars, just as if you were doing a Google review for a restaurant. 5 stars is great, you'd come back or you loved it, and then 1 being the lowest. And we asked tenants to rate the following statements at stars. And the statements were, I like my home, I'm proud to rent, I like the community I live in, and I like my neighbours. So when we asked these, we found that satisfaction with the home is generally high, but it varies by groups. So older people in social housing actually gave the highest ratings for I like my home, indicating high satisfaction. Private renters and Black, Asian, and ethnic minority renters reported significantly lower satisfaction, perhaps showing some of those disparities in housing experiences. Number 2, pride in renting is the lowest rated statement overall. So again, it ties in a little bit to that renting stigma that we unpicked a bit then. You know, that statement, I'm proud to rent, very low, and it scored the lowest. It was just 3.5 stars, but still the lowest overall. And private renters show the least pride, suggesting weaker emotional social attachment to renting within this group. Older people in social housing, they reported the highest pride with 3.8 stars, indicating a more secure, stable / positive renting experience. We also found then again for question 3, sense of community is strongest amongst older people. So I like the community I live in, that had its highest score from that group. And then conversely, LGBTQ plus and Black, Asian, and ethnic minorities actually gave the lower ratings for this statement, perhaps signalling some more significant challenges around social cohesion and perhaps discrimination as well. And then we've got I live in a good area, and that showed a similar pattern. Again, older people more likely to select this. Private renters and under 30s overall provided more neutral scores for this in comparison to the overall sample. They were a bit more on the fence, reflecting more mixed experiences of neighbourhood experience again, and yeah, perceptions. And then we've got perceptions of neighbours as moderatively positive overall. So again, this rated fairly highly. There were major disparities within this. We had about an average of 3.8 or 4 stars there. So reinforcing the generally strong sense of place and satisfaction. Again, older people more likely to choose this option, both actually in private and social housing tenures. So the next one, and this is the final section before I draw these conclusions and findings to a close and open for questions. We wanted to ask our renters about the community they live in and also national matters, so Wales as a whole, because we know there are some significant changes on the horizon, for example, the Senedd elections next year, and we kind of wanted to just get a feel for that. So we asked tenants, again, we said, as David mentioned before, what's the one thing that they'd change about their community? What's the one thing they'd improve? And we found that this year, ASB, reducing ASB, was the leading concern. So that ranked that 17% overall. And social housing renters were far more likely than private renters to select this option. And it's actually moved up in terms of last year. It's increased the number of people who view that as a leading concern. Parking issues ranked then at 13%, and street cleanliness followed closely behind. Public transport, obviously we saw then this kind of potentially linking into those rising living costs complications, but a lot of rural areas and people who responded from rural areas really ranked public transport higher, and access to local services. So both of those things together really reflect the important structural needs of a community. And a notable minority, 8%, said they changed nothing, which is quite positive. Okay, it's a small amount, but still they say I wouldn't change anything at all. However, it's not on the screen, but we did have other lower ranking priorities that still highlight some concerns. So my landlord listening to what the community wants had 6%, which really highlights that stronger desire for influence, accountability, and two-way communication between renters and their landlord. And that was something that tenants did deem as valuable. We also had stronger sense of community, which was 5%. And this was more likely to be chosen by social renters than private renters. perhaps suggesting that those in social housing may feel a greater gap in community cohesion or want that to be more of an integral part of something they change. And we also had fewer second homes slash Airbnbs. This was 6%, but I thought it was really interesting when I looked at the data and I saw the disparities between the fact that rural respondents were far more likely, obviously, than urban respondents to respond to choose this option. And it actually reflects wider concerns about housing scarcity and the pressure that short-term lets place on rural and coastal communities. So we know that the impact of these Airbnbs and short-term lets are more prolific, their impact in these communities, and shows why they were more likely to choose it as an option. And it's still important to mention because not every area in Wales is the same, not everything impacts us in the same way. But it was definitely an issue that was highlighted more prolifically by them. And overall, environmental and streetscape improvements were still seen as quite important. So street lighting was 5% and traffic calming 4%, green space 2%, reflect that broader picture of, a nice and broader amenity and safety concerns for safety and accessibility in communities. So as I mentioned, although there were other lower ranking priorities there, it doesn't mean that they're not necessarily ones to consider when it comes to what the tenants want to change about their communities. Okay, we then asked, and this was the second question, as I mentioned, that was developed in tandem with CHC. We wanted to look beyond the home and the community to kind of broader national matters, particularly around Welsh issues, which offer insight ahead of the 2026 elections. You're going to see a lot of politicians claiming that, they want to change this, they want to change that, but what do renters want? What are the top three things that renters feel matter the most to them in Wales right now? Unsurprisingly, housing ranked the highest. I will add a little caveat onto that, that this is a survey for housing, this survey for housing is renters, so it's not necessarily entirely surprising that they would choose this option. However, it's still really important because it also kind of plays into themes around, like I said, broader change. Health followed quite closely behind, and then the economy. But we actually found that these findings, despite the fact that it is a housing survey, it's a rental survey, they are consistent with wider national research. So many other renters do view housing as a priority, and Shelter Cymru did a 2025 poll with YouGov, and it revealed that 23% of adults in Wales selected housing as one of their top three priorities, making it joint third overall with education. And this alignment suggests that emphasis placed on housing by our respondents reflects not only their individual experiences, but also broader population level priorities as well related to housing. Private and social renter differences matter when it comes to this as well, because private renters were more likely to choose housing as a main issue, 22% of them did, in comparison to 15% of social renters. For both renting groups, it still remained a priority and followed closely by health. However, there were some differences. So, social housing renters placed crime as their third priority, followed by the economy. Contrastingly, private renters chose the economy as third, and crime ranked significantly lower than those in social housing. So again, it does tie into perhaps what set renters are seeing in the community, what they view as a priority in the community. But I thought that that was a really interesting point to kind of look at. And then we've also got other matters. So immigration was the fourth most selected issue on our survey, came in at 8%, with social housing tenants more likely to choose it as an option, 9%, than private renters, who just 5% chose. It does reflect broader public concern, which is often amplified by misinformation about social housing eligibility. For example, Trefalis Housing Association recently had to clarify over the summer that new homes were allocated via the housing register, not to asylum seekers or recent migrants. While we know, if anyone turns on the news, they know that immigration remains a major issue in UK politics, local concern in Wales is generally lower, with only 26%, according to Nation Cymru's respondents, saying that it was a major issue. So I think it's quite important to have that balance. It's important to look at the nuances between these. And it's also important to note that transport and welfare benefits follow closely behind, indicating that tenants were concerned about broader issues affecting their daily lives and financial stability. So that brings me to the overall key findings and recommendations. And we mainly found findings around housing, security, and affordability. We know that a lot of households are relying on universal credit or welfare payments, according to this survey. And a lot of these came from groups such as those in households with disabled and or sensory loss individuals, carers, and neurodiverse households. Private renters face higher rent pressures as well when it comes to cost, and rising costs affect 31% of tenants. Then we got tenant well-being. That was clearly a theme that emerged frequently within this, and it matters. So tenant well-being is sort of around themes like unsettlement, housing insecurity, damp and mold, and affordability. Um, we also found that tenant and landlord interactions are obviously quite varied across different groups. Different groups thought had higher or lower ratings, as we covered. And that renting stigma, that's a really interesting point that I think could definitely do with further exploration in Wales. There are other organisations such as the Poverty Stigma Insight Network that look into this, but I thought that that qualitative data really did reveal quite a lot that often sort of more quantitative data doesn't. Renter ratings, again, just showed an overall picture of how people feel about liking their home, being proud to rent and the like, and there were disparities within that. And then we got the national tenant voice, and that plays a really key role in looking at where we are now and where do renters feel like we need to go. So we did put forth the following recommendations based on these findings. Number one is increased housing affordability and security. We know that, we keep saying that, it comes up constantly, but it's so important. And we really need to keep pushing for this because it's clearly something that's impacting renters across Wales consistently. Improve housing quality, number two. Those timely repairs, adaptations for disabled people that suit them, and tackling hazards like damp and mould. There's going to be some changes coming in next year around this. And we know the Welsh Government consulted on the hazards last year, and it's coming in sort of springtime, we think maybe. So there's some implications for landlords in Wales on how that'll impact them. But we know it's an issue and it needs to change. Then we've got enhanced tenant engagement and have inclusive strategies. So it's quite clear that, certain types of engagement do not work for everyone. And there are groups that have different forms of engagement or preferred methods of communication. So working with landlords working with tenants to ensure that that happens is really, really vital. Number four, tackle rent and stigma. So public awareness campaigns, tenant advocacy services all need to sort of bandy together to try and reframe renting and the realities of renting for many people, because clearly there's a significant lack of understanding on a societal level of renting as a choice when actually it's just a reality that many people do. And there are countries across the world where home ownership is really not as big of a deal as it is in this country. It's the norm to rent. It's nothing bad. There's not negative connotations associated with it. So I think the UK has a long way to go, and obviously in Wales too, in terms of tackling that stigma. We got number five, invest in community wellbeing. So clearly reducing antisocial behaviour is a key part of that. Improving the infrastructure and support landlord community collaboration. And then lastly, inform policy. So continue to ensure that tenant voices themselves influence policy and all the different elements that don't just span into housing. We know that housing and health, the economy, they're all linked. But ensuring that tenant voices kind of come through within that is really, really vital and in that decision-making process. And it's something we need to continue to push on with. So, our next steps are the full Pulse report, including a shorter executive summary of findings, is on our website. David will hopefully put it in the chat now as well. And we're also happy to organise a discussion if you've got any queries on how you want to use these findings in your organisation, or if you're a tenant as well and you would like to kind of look at things you want to do with your landlord and inform that, or even just have a discussion with us, then please do get in touch, because we are here to support you. And I know it sounds cheesy and you'll see it through the report, I've put the matters in, but I wanted to take the time to genuinely thank everyone who's shared this, given their views, and helped to make this come together because it is true, you do matter, and we want to keep ensuring that that is something that remains to be seen for politicians, for landlords, and for tenants themselves as we all work together. Okay, my sore throat has actually struggled through very well regarding that. I'm going to stop sharing now, and I just wanted to ask if there are any questions because I'm aware there was a long time listening to me speak, and thank you all for coming. Any questions?
Just comments on the side while we wait. Any questions? Um, some things around bedroom tax. You mentioned, the fact that it hasn't gone away, and I think Sarah from Pobble talked about that. A number of people living, in maybe oversized properties compared because families have moved on. Um, and I just mentioned that Cardiff Council are doing some really interesting work on this, and maybe we might need to get them into a session to talk about what they're doing because uh, it's quite impressive. They're targeting downsizers and freeing up big properties. But another day for that.
Hey, well, thank you. I can see some interesting comments in the chat. Thank you everyone for providing that. I see a couple of people have had to drop off as well. Sarah, yeah, bedroom tat, yeah. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm assuming based on the silence that there are no further questions. I appreciate as well that it's, crawling towards Christmas and thank you all so much for your time. And yeah, I wanted to wish everybody a happy festive period. If you have any questions or follow up about the report, then please do get in contact. And yeah. Oh, Shelter Cymru. Thank you. Okay, thank you, Philip. That's great. I'll have a read of that.